What follows is a brief construction montage.
Late again.
Limited time only.
Flashback.
While Patchy pulls himself together, let's see how SpongeBob's party is shaping up.
End of flashback. Soon after. Montage.
Previously, yesterday, meanwhile, at the Krusty Krab. Meanwhile, back in the Lola.
Meanwhile, at the palace of King Poseidon, ruler of the seven seas.
A few moments later.
Moments later.
Many moments later.
More moments later.
A little later.
A little while later.
Later.
Later. Later. Later. Later.
Later.
Later. In the void.
Later still.
Happy friendiversary.
Later that same evening.
Later that day. Later that night.
Later that night.
Later that night.
More later work.
Much later. Much later.
Much later.
Much later.
Not much later.
So much later that the old narrator got tired of waiting and they had to hire a new one.
The following Thursday,
You get the idea.
just then, by sheer coincidence, 12 o'clock midnight, 3:28 a.m., 7:59 a.m.,
4 o'clock in the afternoon.
8:01 p.m., 10 seconds later, 12 seconds later,
47 seconds later. 47 seconds later. A few seconds later. 1 minute later.
1 minute, 37 seconds later, 2 very boring minutes later, 5 minutes later, 5 minutes later, 5 minutes later, 11 minutes later, 15 minutes later, 20 minutes later,
A few minutes later.
a few minutes later, a little longer than a few minutes later,
Many minutes later.
1 hour later, 1 hour later,
1 hour later.
1 hour later!
1 hour later.
1 hour later.
1 hour later. 1 hour later. 1 hour later. 80 minutes later.
2 hours later, 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 2 hours later,
2 hours later. 2 hours later.
3 hours later, 3 hours later, 3 hours later,
3 hours later. 3 hours later. 3 hours later.
5 hours later, 346 minutes later, 6 hours later, 6 hours later, 6.5 hours later, 7 hours later, 8 hours later, 8 hours later,
9 hours later. 10 hours later.
approximately 10 hours later,
12 sleepless hours later.
several song-filled hours later, many hours later,
Many hours of fun time later.
many chilly hours later,
Many unbearable hours later.
tomorrow for sure, 24 hours later, 24 hours later, early the next morning, 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 the next morning,
The next morning.
the next,
The next morning.
the next morning,
The next morning.
the next morning,
The next morning.
the next day, the next day,
The next day. The next day. The next day.
the next day, the following day, tomorrow,
The very next evening. The next evening. The next Christmas. 1 day later.
day 2, 48 hours later, 2 days later, day 3, 72 hours later, 3 days later, 3 days later, 3 days later, 3 days later, day 4,
4 to 6 days later. 4 to 6 more days later.
Several days later.
Several days later. Several long days later.
1 week later. 1 week later.
1 week later. 1 weekend of pampering later.
2 weeks later. 16 paranoia-filled days later. 3 weeks later. 3 weeks later. 4 to 6 weeks later. 6 months later. 6 months later.
6 months later!
7 months later.
Several months later. Many months later.
70 years later.
75 years later.
2,000 years later.
3,000 years later.
5 million years later.
1 entree later. An eternity later.
1 eternity later. Opening night. A lot of boring math later.
Many frame building attempts later. Many memories later. Many tic-tacs later.
Many secret parties later.
Many toys later. 1 humongous meal later.
1 semester later. 1 season later. 8 semesters later. 1 debt to society later.
1 very long digestive tract later. 1 loading screen later.
1 little boost to the surface later.
1 pathetic sob story later. 1 frozen wasteland later. 1 long angry line later.
1 beautiful Christmas morning later.
1 shift later.
1 shift later.
1 extremely annoying shift later. 1 winner later.
1 nap later. 1 operation later.
1 pair of pants later.
1 million, zillion, jillion, dillion, cotillion times later. 2 idiots later. 82 kilometers later.
242 explosions later.
298 frozen patties later. Thousands of tears later.
3,000 whoop-whoos later.
5,000 celebrities later.
80,000 impressions later.
Would you please stop imitating me? It is starting to get very annoying.
A few inches later. Eventually. Several bad puns later.
Several bouquets later. Even more boat building attempts later.
Graduation day. Epilogue. Epilogue. We hope you enjoyed this brief construction montage.